All right, so I hope that you had a nice break. I hope you found those questioning techniques to be effective. But of course, we're still in charge, and sometimes we need to give feedback. So we're going to talk about how to make that effective feedback. All right, so the importance of feedback to get started. I'm going to show a short clip of Bill Gates here talking about the need for real feedback for teachers. Now, while this is an American example, I just want you to pay attention to the Canadian markers.
So today I want to talk about how we can help all teachers get the tools for improvement they want and deserve. Let's start by asking, who's doing well? Well, unfortunately, there's no international ranking tables for teacher feedback systems. So I looked at the countries whose students perform well academically and looked at what they're doing to help their teachers improve. Consider the rankings for reading proficiency. The US isn't number one. We're not even in the top 10. We're tied for 15th with Iceland and Poland. Now, out of all the places that do better than the US in reading, how many of them have a formal system for helping teachers improve? 11 out of 14. The US is tied for 15th in reading, but we're 23rd in science and 31st in math. So there's really only one area where we're near the top, and that's in failing to give our teachers the help they need to develop their skills. Let's look at the best academic performer, the province of Shanghai, China. Now they rank number one across the board in reading, math, and science. And one of the keys to Shanghai's incredible success is the way they help teachers keep improving. They make sure that younger teachers get a chance to watch master teachers at work. They have weekly study groups where teachers get together and talk about what's working. They even require each teacher to observe and give feedback to their colleagues. You might ask, why is the system?
All right, so here we see it's clear that teacher growth is important to student success in schools. We must work together to improve teaching if we want students to succeed. How do we do that? We collaborate and we dialogue and we give feedback. This is also something that, of course, we are responsible for in our LQS standards in Alberta here. We have to engage in leading teachers and providing instructional leadership. And a big component of this is engaging in mentorship and dialogue with teachers. So, studies show that generative dialogue can be found at the heart of effective schools. Hollingworth et al. In a study on schools with exceptional culture found trust, knowledge of their staff, and of course, purposeful and explicit communication to be the key. And many elements of generative leadership and dialogue can be found in the recommendations that Brandon et al. Find in a study on the challenges to effective teacher supervision and evaluation. These include inquiry-based supervision, something we've talked about, distributed leadership, and finally, consistent support and supervision across a teacher's career. It's simple. To have teachers grow and develop their skills, they need effective feedback, and that's what's going to lead to student success. So, we're going to talk about some specific examples of feedback with some concrete examples, and then we're going to talk about where this fits and where you can begin with this in your schools. So, changing how we give feedback. I'm going to read through these, and I'm just going to read through an example so that you can really see what this looks like in action. This is, of course, all in your slides, so you can refer back to it. So, focus feedback on actions rather than people. So instead of saying, you seem uninterested in engaging in PD this year, we would say, you haven't engaged in many activities related to your PD goals this year. We're talking about the actual actions. We're leaving out those judgment or criticizing words. Focus feedback on observations rather than inferences. You seem unhappy about how you're dealing with classroom management. We would say, I'm sensing by the tone of your voice that you're unhappy with how your lesson went. Focus feedback on behavior specific to a situation, preferably in the here and now, rather than on abstract recollections of if and when. So instead of saying, how are you engaging with the community? We would say, this year we've been tracking your engagement with the community together. These are the goals you've set. How have they gone? And what will you continue to do next year? So very specific. Focus feedback on sharing ideas and data rather than giving advice. So instead of saying, you're very negative about this new program, can you try implementing one area? We would say, can you share your concerns with the new reading program? So you can see it's not always even a positive conversation. We can ask for feedback back to us about why people aren't invested. Focus feedback on exploration of alternatives rather than answers or solutions. So instead of saying, maybe you should try having options for assessments, we would say, what are 2 ways you've attempted to differentiate for your students? So again, that really open-ended conversation leading to questions or maybe some inquiry. Focus feedback on its value to others, not the release it provides for the person giving the feedback. So again, not sharing war stories and saying, well, when I had a similar issue, but instead saying, okay, what are the best possible outcomes here? Focus feedback through a finite usable amount of information rather than on the total amount you might want to give. So instead of listing all of the things that you've noticed and criticizing a lesson, let's pick one area you want to improve and focus on it this term. Focus feedback on time and place so that personal data can be shared at appropriate times. So instead of saying, come down to my office and discuss this evaluation, we would say, email me a few times this week that work for you so we can discuss your lesson. And finally, focus feedback on what is said rather than why it is said. So instead of saying the scores on these assessments are low, we might say, I have ways to boost the scores on these tests for your students. I know standardized tests aren't always a good assessment of students, but I have some ways to support student learning and improve these scores. So we want to take that shift from the observable to the assumed, bringing up the questions of motive and intent. All right, I want to show you this short clip here about, she gives a great example of how we would structure a conversation and use these feedback tools that we've been talking about.
If you look at like a carpenter, they have a toolbox. A dentist, they have their drills. In our era and the type of work most of us are doing, the tool we most need is actually centered around being able to give and receive feedback well. Humans have been talking about feedback for centuries. In fact, Confucius, way back in 500 BC, talked about how important it is to be able to say difficult messages well. But to be honest, we're still pretty bad at it. In fact, a recent Gallup survey found that only 26% of employees strongly agree that the feedback they get actually improves their work. Those numbers are pretty dismal. So what's going on? The way that most people give their feedback actually isn't brain friendly. People fall into one of 2 camps. Either they're of the camp that is very indirect and soft, and the brain doesn't even recognize that feedback is being given, or it's just simply confused. Or they fall into the other camp of being too direct. And with that, it tips the other person into the land of being defensive. There's this part of the brain called the amygdala, and it's scanning at all times to figure out whether the message has a social threat attached to it. With that, we'll move forward in defensiveness, or move backwards in retreat. And what happens is the feedback giver then starts to dysregulate as well. They add more ums and ahs and justifications, and the whole thing gets wonky really fast. It doesn't have to be this way. I and my team have spent many years going into different companies and asking who here is a great feedback giver. Anybody who's named again and again, we actually bring into our labs to see what they're doing differently. And what we find is that there's a 4-part formula that you can use to say any difficult message well. Okay, are you ready for it? Here we go. The first part of the formula is what we call the micro yes. Great feedback givers begin their feedback by asking a question that is short but important. It lets the brain know that feedback is actually coming. It would be something, for example, like, do you have 5 minutes to talk about how that last conversation went? Or I have some ideas for how we can improve things. Can I share them with you? This micro yes question does two things for you. First of all, it's going to be a pacing tool. It lets the other person know that feedback is about to be given. And the second thing it does is it creates a moment of buy-in. I can say yes or no to that yes or no question. And with that, I get a feeling of autonomy. The second part of the feedback formula is going to be giving your data point. Here you should name specifically what you saw or heard and cut out any words that aren't objective. There's a concept we call blur words. A blur word is something that can mean different things to different people. Blur words are things that are not specific. So for example, if I say, you shouldn't be so defensive, or you could be more proactive. What we see great feedback givers doing differently is they'll convert their blur words into actual data points. So for example, instead of saying, you aren't reliable, we would say, you said you'd get that email to me by 11, and I still don't have it yet. Specificity is also important when it comes to positive feedback. And the reason for that is that we want to be able to specify exactly what we want the other person to increase or diminish. And if we stick with blur words, they actually won't have any clue particularly what to do going forward to keep repeating that behavior. The third part of the feedback formula is the impact statement. Here you name exactly how that data point impacted you. So for example, I might say, because I didn't get the message, I was blocked on my work and couldn't move forward. Or I really liked how you added those stories because it helped me grasp the concepts faster. It gives you a sense of purpose and meaning and logic between the points, which is something the brain really craves. The fourth part of the feedback formula is a question. Great feedback givers wrap their feedback message with a question. They'll ask something like, well, how do you see it? Or, this is what I'm thinking we should do, but what are your thoughts on it? What it does is it creates commitment rather than just compliance. It makes the conversation no longer be a monologue, but rather becomes a joint problem-solving situation. But there's one last thing. Great feedback givers not only can say messages well, but also they ask for feedback regularly. In fact, our research on perceived leadership shows that you shouldn't wait for feedback to be given to you, what we call push feedback, but rather you should actively ask for feedback, what we call pulling feedback. Pulling feedback establishes you as a continual learner and puts the power in your hands. The most challenging situations are actually the ones that call for the most skillful feedback. But it doesn't have to be hard. Now that you know this 4-part formula, you can mix and match it to make it work for any difficult conversation.
All right, so there we see a really useful 4-part formula for having these conversations and being able to sandwich them into the conversations that you're having. We see a lot of the strategies that we've already been talking about, especially the questioning, keeping those conversations open-ended. All right, so now that you have seen and heard some examples of effective feedback, I challenge you to pick one of these suggestions, go back in the PowerPoints, and write down one way you plan to use it this week. Put it in a reminder in your phone so that you can reflect and see if you've done that, and if not, set a goal for the next week. I'll give you a second to do that now. You can pause. All right, so where does this fit in the grand scheme of things? Obviously, you're not just going to be able to walk back into your school or your team and start having great, effective conversations and sitting people down and questioning them and having effective feedback without some sort of structure. So inquiry-based growth plans are a great way to begin this work. This is where we are working with teachers to choose their own goals and develop some sort of growth plan for the year. And so what you're going to do is you're going to use all these questioning techniques and these feedback tools that you've been given in these conversations that you're hopefully having monthly, reflecting on these individual inquiry-based growth plans. And you're going to ask these questions until your goals are really measurable and actionable. So if a teacher comes to you in the beginning of this meeting and says, I want to implement Daily 5 into my literacy program, that's their goal, You're going to use those Socratic questions, and you're going to really get them to narrow down what it is they're trying to do in their classroom until it's measurable and actionable. And so an example of that might be, in what ways and to what extent will Daily 5 have an impact on my struggling readers? This is something they can be working towards and measure and get data and can be doing some action research in. And it keeps it accountable for everyone, so that there's something to reflect upon when you meet again and use these questions again, and then maybe be giving some feedback to them, like we've discussed. These 4 questions are something that you can use during each of these sessions. These 4 questions are: what did you do since the last time we met? What did you learn? What evidence do you have to show that impact is occurring? And what will you do between now and the next time you meet? And then again, using all the tools you have in your toolbox when you're discussing these growth plans. All right, so I'm going to give you one last break, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about the big picture of conversations.